Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and happy Caribbean American Heritage Month. My name is Larry Socha. I'm the Public Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Bridgetown, Barbados. And I'm really happy to be here this afternoon for a great program with, I'm gonna be honest here, Kevin, one of my favorite people in Barbados, and that's Kevin Farmer, who's the Deputy Director at the Barbados Museum within the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bridgetown and its garrison.
Thanks,
Quick
Larry.
Of course. Quick kind of words of introduction here. The way it's going to run today, this is kind of our first virtual program to celebrate Caribbean American Heritage Month. There are subsequent programs taking place the rest of the month. I want to say this up front, that next week we will be having a continued conversation about the links between the United States and Barbados with something called the Road to Emancipation, exploring the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor. And that's a heritage corridor that runs from North Carolina all the way down to Florida along the Atlantic coast there. So please do join us for the Road to Emancipation, exploring the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. That's next Thursday at 6 p.m. And then the week after that, that's the 24th of June, we'll be joined by Sir Hilary Beckles, who will speak with a professor at Lincoln University, a historically Black university in the United States, with Dr. Daryl Zizwe Poe there. For a discussion about democracy, youth activism, and again, Caribbean American heritage. So I'm so happy that we can be joined here on this first Thursday discussion by Kevin Farmer, again, the Deputy Director at the Barbados Museum. He is also a lecturer, or has lectured at the University of the West Indies, out in St. Augustine in archaeology in the history department there, I believe. Also a lecturer here at UWI Cave Hill. He's a published scholar and author. But like I said, you can find him just there at the garrison at the Barbados Museum. So Kevin, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Really excited to talk about the subject today, which is the documentary I know that we've both seen and that I hope members of the public on Facebook have seen as well. And that is Beyond Barbados, a Carolina connection. That Carolina connection was made clear in that hour-long documentary, which was made possible by public broadcasting and by the state of South Carolina. I just kind of want to start maybe with your impressions. I'm sure a lot of that history was familiar. We've talked a little bit about how you've been to Jackson, Mississippi, and been to other parts of the United States, but you've never explored that kind of Carolina's heritage corridor. So what did you take away from the documentary?
Thank you so much for having me, Larry, and thank you for everyone who's viewing. I think it's important to have that discussion. In fact, the documentary revealed some things I knew, but it packaged it in a completely different way. It's always good when you have history to see what the context and connections are. And at the end of it, all I would say is I need to go to South Carolina. I've clearly missed out on a major educational opportunity by not going to South Carolina, walking Charleston, going into the Low Country, going into the Gullah Geechee community, and having in fact a better sense of how those Barbadians of European and African descent changed and transformed those spots of land along the Cape Fear and along the Ashley River. And I think those connections are important. They were mentioned in the film, but I dare say the film to me is almost a teaser. It's almost like in 4 parts, and then in those 4 parts you can then get an additional 4 parts. So you're perhaps looking at a 16-part series, if done properly, can really cement those strong bonds between South Carolina and Barbados, and recognizing that when we say South Carolina, we include North Carolina as well as the original Carolinas and parts of Georgia. So when we begin to talk about that Atlantic influence of Barbados in the early 13 colonies, we're including that portion, but we also need to go a little bit eastward to Connecticut and Rhode Island, where there are ever connections. But I think the strongest ones really are there in the Carolinas.
Yeah, I take your point that you could break this down into like a Netflix series or something.
It would be.
There's really so much history there. I mean, when they started talking about the Lord Proprietors and yeah, we're talking about the restoration of Charles II in England,
Precisely.
1660, or even before that, the Native Americans who lived here in Barbados, or the Native Americans who lived in the Carolinas, and then
Yes.
the Goose Creek men who were sold into slavery, and some of them ending up here in Barbados. I mean, that history is 400 years and more. It's really impressive.
Yeah, very impressive. In fact, I must admit, the one thing that I keep hearing about, but I need to find more information on, are those Native Americans who were sent from the Carolinas down to Barbados. I know a little bit about the Seminole Indians in Florida who were sent down, but I know nothing about those Native Americans from the Carolinas sent down to Barbados. I think that's a thread that we need to pull on and to explore a little bit more. As for the Lord Proprietors, they've been talked about. I don't think we talk about them enough to really understand what they did and then what the Goose Creek men did. And the missing narrative for me is, yes, they took their enslaved people. Do we know who some of those people were? Because the records at that time, you had to state what your property was. So it means that there's somewhere a set of records that we haven't yet stumbled across, that the documentary kind of says, well, that's something you need to do, simply by introducing us to the topic. I think that's really, really key. And of course, to further elaborate on the fact of the parish distribution, and how South Carolina is in fact dominated by parishes and those connections. So,
well, one of the things that comes out in the documentary is all the different names and the continuity of names, whether names parishes or family names. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, I've never actually been to Charleston, South Carolina. I've been close. I've been to Savannah, Georgia, so it's still in that same area. And there's a great little museum outside of Savannah called the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, which talks about the African American history in the Low Country along the coast. But could you talk a little bit more about the names and kind of maybe the familial connections?
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's deal with the names, which seem almost simple. You've got parishes like St. Andrew and Christ Church, and the fact that they're using the names of saints in the naming of spaces. But then let's get into the family names: Draytons, Militons, Colletons. Names which still have a historical resonance in Barbados, but also have the same resonance in the Carolinas, recognizing that the plantations in South Carolina would have been seen as provisioning plantations. They would have provided everything from cattle, meat, rice, lumber to Barbados in exchange for rum and molasses and sugar. And you've got these owners who are perhaps owning two plantations at the same time, and then later on family members who are owning two different plantations, but they're trading with each other, whether directly or through middlemen. And you've got this almost continuation of that, which kind of gets lost after the Civil War, because there's some interesting history in there when Charleston burns at a particular time, or when Bridgetown is destroyed by fire in the 1780s. There's a collection taken up in both places to help rebuild what they're referred to as sister colonies. So which means that even up to some time before the Civil War in the 1860s, there's still the maintenance of that particular memory of there being that historical connection between Charleston and Barbados that seemingly gets lost after the Civil War, and then isn't picked up again maybe late 1980s, early 1990s by those historians and preservationists who have an interest and have sought to remind people, oh, there's this connection that you wouldn't believe given how the history of the two places have changed over the last 200 plus years.
Yeah. And that's why next week we'll be speaking with some of them, and it's really exciting then, and hope that those who joined today at noon can join us next Thursday at 6 o'clock.
Oh yeah, definitely.
one of the questions on my mind, though, Kevin, and as a person of African descent, I want to put this question to you. We talk about, there's such strong history between Barbados and South Carolina or the Carolinas.
Mm-hmm.
But so much of that history is a painful history of people owning other people. I mean, individuals being treated as property. I mean, how do you celebrate a connection and a history, but still recognize the trauma and the evil that slavery was?
Yeah, I think we call it commemoration, and understanding that in the commemoration of what is a traumatic past, there is then a celebration of the resiliency of the persons who had to go through that trauma, whether it is the maintenance of kinfolk or kinship relationships, whether that's through naming practices, whether that's through the maintenance of a culinary tradition, whether that's through a recognition of passing down particular cultural norms and memory from one generation to the next. It's that resiliency that we celebrate whilst we recognize and commemorate the trauma. And there's no underrating how horrific that trauma was. We shouldn't shy away from it. We need to talk about it. People keep saying it's in the past. It's not. It's very much in the present. In this instance, the past is the present, and we need to continue to have the discussions, have the dialogue, and hopefully we'll come out at the other end. And the other end is recognition, reconciliation, and dare I say, reparations. But I would allow Sir Hilary, who's leading that for the region, to really deal with that issue, which I think is an important one, and recognizing that it's in as much as it's an economic one, it's not necessarily just about cash. But that I will allow him to take the lead on that discussion, but it's an important one. And it can only happen when we recognize what that trauma has been and what its legacy is.
Absolutely. I think the whole issue of restorative justice is an important one. And seeing my own president start that conversation in visiting Tulsa and the 100th anniversary of the massacre there in 1921, is a testament to the importance of having these discussions, finding a way forward together in an inclusive way forward.
Yeah.
Kevin, what surprised you in the film? Now, you've already mentioned the kind of the Native American connection, those, not the Seminoles, but other groups in the United States, sold into slavery by the Goose Creek Men or others. But what in that documentary kind of grabbed your attention, or maybe jogged something in your memory that you?
I think a lot grabbed my attention is a whole discussion about race, and the fact that it's in a way we take it for granted, but it comes from a particular place and it's sold to another space. But more importantly, when the Carolinas makes the transition out of cattle, because people forget this, there's that early tradition of cattle rearing for at least 100 years, and then that transition to rice in that period as well. And the fact that you deliberately went back to the western coast of Africa and sought out those persons who would have had knowledge about growing rice, and you deliberately bought them and brought them over to exploit this new crop. And then that then changes the cuisine, not only in the Carolinas, but in the Atlantic world. Mm-hmm. And the importation and the introduction of beans and its use with rice. That jumped out, and I wanted to hear more. But it was, again, the documentary gave you a full meal, but then there's a recognition, okay, there's some really interesting side desserts that you need to go down. The other thing that I think stood out for me were the introduction to Gullah, but the need to know more. I think that was the other thing that really stood out. Outside of the fact that at the end of the 56 minutes, you understood that globalization is not a modern construct. When you look at the Carolinas and you look at Barbados, and you look at that migration and colonization and oppression, that is part and parcel of the global economy that we still exist in. And in fact, we can argue that global economy starts with sugar, slavery, and rice. And we need to understand what that has created along the way.
I think that the documentary does an excellent job of providing some of the economic background that gave rise to, the different political or social outcomes. I mean, learning about how tobacco failed in Barbados and moved to the sugar economy is what squeezed out some of those colonizers and caused them to go to the Carolinas. Really, really interesting kind of economic history there. And then, as you say, and I love the food metaphors of giving you a taster and not a full meal. But the focus then on the rice economy and then the competition in the Carolinas is really interesting.
Yeah, completely interesting. And then beyond that, again, dealing with the food, how that enriches the people. You've got the continuation of a cultural legacy, but then, even though we don't want to talk about it, how that then directly allows for the development of an enslaved population to reproduce on both sides of the Atlantic. And the other little kernel in there is that early discussion of an inner triangular trading route, because we always see it as Africa to the Caribbean or North America and then back to Europe. But what the documentary also points out, in fact, it's Barbados to the Carolinas and to Europe, or Barbados to the Carolinas and back to the Barbados. And then so there's that inner triangular route that we need to begin to unpick and understand what the consequences and influences were for that. I think that's also one of those interesting threads that we need to pull on.
No, I find it amazing that I think many Americans grow up with the textbook and as you say, the triangle on the map from England to West Africa to the Caribbean or maybe up to Boston or the other port cities in the United States. But I think the documentary, rightfully so, starts out with the lines of that history is complex, right? And as they weave together all these, whether it's economics or the different ethnic groups or civilizations, and I see that Rhoda Green has joined, and she's in the documentary and talks about a clash of civilizations. And there's so much here to unpack and discuss. So thank you, Rhoda, for the comment here on the colonial backdrop provides Barbados with an opportunity to tell its own story of struggle and progress into the present. I mean, I
completely agree.
For one thing, at the end there, when they start talking about architecture, I would have never put together the fact that Arlington House in some way would have served as a model for architecture in Charleston. It's something completely new to me.
Yeah, and the other jump there is that when you look at Arlington and you recognize where that would have come from, it's almost an adaptation to environment. Because if you for those people familiar with Barbados, Arlington is in the let's call it the north of the island. Speightstown, not too far away from Speightstown, is one of the oldest Jacobin mansions in the Western Hemisphere. What's interesting is that there are 3 Jacobin mansions in the Western Hemisphere: 2 in Barbados, St. Nicholas Abbey and Drax Hall. The third is the United States, and it is, was it Drayton? Is it Drayton or Milton? But in the Carolinas. And they would have had fireplaces in that space. Not a fireplace for cooking, but a fireplace for warmth. It's not a hearth in which to cook food, but it was, you literally bring wholesale your English architecture over to the Caribbean, but then adaptations are made. And Arlington is one of those early adaptations. How do you build a structure on a rather narrow piece of land that might give you depth but not width? And you've got Arlington, that style house then being taken to to the Carolinas and dominating present day Charleston, and ever spaces as well. And of course, when we say Charleston, we talk about place names. Let's not forget that one of the main streets in Charleston is Broad Street. And the main street in Barbados is Broad Street as well.
Yeah.
So we talk about place names and continuity. But then the question to ask is this: is the wood taken from the Carolinas and brought to Barbados to be used as housing, does that develop the chattel house in Barbados? And that's an open question. But simply because of the supply of pre-cut links of wood from the Carolinas, they then have an influence on what we see as vernacular Barbadian housing today in the chattel house, which is slightly different from in the South, what you refer to as, was it shotgun houses. Although again, they're pre-cut links of wood, modular homes. So again, there are these interesting little tidbits that have yet to be further teased out about what our connection is. And to go back to Rhoda's point, that colonial backdrop is really what makes Barbados Barbados. And to use that really bad pugilistic metaphor allows us to punch above our weight, is literally built on the monies derived from sugar and rum and slavery, which allows us to influence not only the setup of the adventurers in a colony in the Carolinas, but perhaps as well the economic underpinnings of providing capital to finance particular ventures beyond just the movement of bodies. That becomes extremely important as well. Yeah.
Yeah, as as we think about the tie between Barbados and the United States, of course, for those in Barbados, it's very clear just down the street from your museum, the George Washington House is an example of that. And I think many Americans might think, wow, how exotic for George Washington to leave the United States and go with his half brother down to Barbados. But if we put ourselves in the mindset of the time, where else would he go? I mean, Barbados was the center of the action in many ways, the wealthiest, one of the most densely populated areas in the whole English Empire.
Yeah.
So it made a lot of sense.
Oh, definitely. I mean, this is it. By the end of the 17th century, Barbados is the richest spot of land for the British, for all of their English colonies in the New World. Let that sink in for a bit, and then give you this interesting tidbit that the second largest port city at that time in the British Empire, or the nascent British Empire in the New World, was Bridgetown. The only port town larger was Boston at that time. So when a young colonial is being told, well, you need to venture to a place where your brother can recuperate, where there's strong trade links, and it's easy to get to, you go to Barbados. And he comes to an island where the port city would have been the largest he's ever seen. The majority of the housing stock that he would have walked past would have been buildings built of brick and not wood. He would have had a thriving community, thriving businesses built on the backs of enslaved people, but a cosmopolitan, wealthy space. Let's forget it's an island. A cosmopolitan, wealthy space, who, by the time he gets here, are beginning to have those discussions about representation and taxation, because they've had a House of Parliament since 1634, and dealing with how do we as colonies still become autonomous and get to make our own rules. And of course, a lot of that political thought travels with the Goose Creek men when they settled in the Carolinas in the 1670s and 1680s, and they continue that discussion that they can't be taxed unless they're represented, and that they must be able to rule themselves. Although they take it to a totally different extent and decide ruling myself means not listening to the rules.
Yeah.
That I will do trade with pirates and whomever else I want to do trade with, because the only rule for me is to make money.
Well, I think that, and the documentary, I think, makes that connection between that independent spirit of the Goose Creek men out of Barbados, and then even extending that into the John C. Calhouns and others who rejected the authority of the federal government in Washington, D.C., making South Carolina the first state to secede from the Union. So there's kind of this, so independence used for both good and for bad, one might say, if you were
yes, and within that independence, there's that continual resistance by the enslaved people, whether it's to physically run away or to hold on to particular cultural traits, which is in itself a form of resistance. So you've got this continual resistance along two parallels that you're still trying to reconcile up to today. Yeah.
Well, and I think then you look at Bridgetown and Charleston at the same time in 2020, and perhaps the most important statues in those two cities both came down last year. John C. Calhoun in Charleston, and then maybe not most important, but most recognizable statues.
Yes.
And then Horatio Nelson coming down here in Bridgetown.
Yep.
How, even in your career, in the long spans of history, your small piece of it, how has the discussion about slavery and identity and the colonial past, both of Bridgetown and Barbados and of the Carolinas, how has that changed over time for you, Kevin?
I think the change has been one of a greater willingness to have the discussion. It used to be that no one wanted to really talk about enslavement. People, you would hear anecdotally, oh no one wants to hear about the past. That isn't true anymore. I think the last maybe 15 years, out of say the last 25 years, you've really seen people tying it within social justice issues and restorative justice, saying that we've got to talk about enslavement. We've got to come to terms with what this is and how it has transformed this is our societies, and to have that open and frank discussion. So way back for us, 1998, 99, as there were discussion about national heroes, there was a committee set up to look into how to commemorate those heroes, and at the same time, what do we do with those traumatic colonial structures, i.e. Nelson statue and others, that speak to an aspect of our colonial history that is still painful. And at the time, the public said they wanted it taken down. I mean, it took some years. There were two other committees set up where the people said the same thing. And I think what coalesced, even though unfortunately coming out of the murder of George Floyd, was people saying, okay, this is a time for change. This is a time for us to not say we want to do things, or we want to have reconciliation, or we want to talk about social justice, but let's begin to do those physical things to make those changes, whether it's policy, whether it is something that can be concrete and visible. So in both our spaces, mine a little less contested than yours, given the counter protests about removing Calhoun, and the fact that the person who first got the job, the contractor, had to say, no, not me, I'll go to someone else who eventually did it. The greater society, or the majority of the society, recognizing, okay, this is the time for change. Let us start incrementally, but let us also start with something that's extremely symbolic. And one of the greatest symbols are your statuary, because you're saying to people, this represents us. This is what you should live to, aspire to be. Or in some instances, this reminds you of a past that we want you to remember, so that you don't ask for change. The statues can speak in multiple ways. And in both of our spaces, that political decision was taken, even though socially people had arrived at that decision a long time ago. The political decision was taken and it came down. But you're seeing resistance on your side of the Atlantic, which needs to be continually resisted, no pun intended. And is even happening on the other side, because Colston came down in, was it Birmingham? And there are now talks, oh, we're not to touch them. History is not static. We must remember why these statues were put up. They were put up at a particular point in time to make particular political agendas happen. The political agenda is changing, and it's changing to one that is to be more reflective and to be more inclusive. And that change is inevitable, even though there are persons who simply don't want change and want to revert back to their own interpretation of a history that, in fact, in some instances never was, or a history that only happened because of systematic oppression.
Yeah. A history that was written in a certain way at a different time.
At a different time.
The whole past and the whole truth.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
It's fascinating things to talk about, but important discussions to have, and even more important actions to take. I want to open it up for questions here in a couple minutes. I know we're halfway through our hour, so please do throw your questions into the comment section on Facebook. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. I know Barbadians are always good at not maybe asking a question, but giving a comment as well. So welcome comments too if there's no question. But Kevin, I want to maybe kind of end on this point in our one-on-one conversation. What is it like at the museum for either Americans who visit or others, in the diaspora community, when they come in and start asking questions? I mean, where can they go? I know the National Archives is featured in the documentary as one point of reference, but what are your thoughts both for Barbadians who have tuned in as well as Americans who have tuned in this conversation?
What I'll say when you come and visit the Barbados Museum, you will have that introduction to what enslavement was like and what it created. Both within our exhibitions, and if you were to go upstairs to our specialist library, you can delve further into having a greater understanding about enslavement. But the museum also has the great privilege, of managing the enslaved burial ground at Newton, which was excavated by two American researchers in Jerry Handler and Frederick Lang in the late 1970s, which in a way revolutionized how one thought about how enslaved people lived and died, because you actually had evidence of an enslaved cemetery. And the cemetery is still extremely important and even unique in a way within this region. It's the only known and excavated communal enslaved burial ground found on a plantation setting. And someone sent me an article. They found one recently. I've got to read it, but I think it might mean 2 plantations and not 1. But that's the importance. And we are, in fact, in the process of reinterpreting that site this year. So by the 1st of August, when persons come to Barbados and Barbadians who are here, when they visit the enslaved burial ground at Newton, they will have a greater understanding and interpretation about that site and its importance not only for Barbadians, but its importance to people in the diaspora, as it is really and truly a place of commemoration, and hopefully will be a place of healing as well.
Excellent. Wonderful to hear. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, no problem.
Good day to you, Kimlin Gibbs. Great to have you, and greetings up to Charleston, South Carolina, to Heather Hodges, who's joined, and many others here. Welcome your questions. Heather's chiming in here.
Okay. If Americans suspect they have shared Barbadian heritage, are there genealogical and archival resources available on the island or online that they can consult? I'll say on the island. We're trying to move to online. So you can find those resources at the Barbados Department of Archives or at the Barbados Museum. In fact, we run a genealogy group that invites all to participate in finding out about their family history. So those are the two places where you can go and find that information. We've been limited because of funding resources, but we are starting to build out so that persons can actually go online. So it makes it easier for you to find family. Although I would say there's nothing better than finding family than visiting an island.
It sounds like it's straight from the tourism board, Kevin.
There you go. Well,
oh, yeah.
I must play my part.
American Airlines from Charlotte to Miami. Yeah.
See, there you go. But I think also in the reverse, because we're thinking of, okay, African Americans coming to Barbados, but what about those Barbadians going to the Carolinas to find out about family or family that they never knew about? That's something else I think that we can look at. Again, some of the newer research at Newton, we've been doing whole genome testing where we can actually identify where people would have originated from. And I think that is quite fascinating. And we're looking to see how that might be used to make the connections with a contemporary population so people can get a better sense of where they're from. I think we're in the nascent stages of that. I think that's going to be an exciting aspect of genealogical research for us in the next decade.
No, I was remarking to members who will of the different heritage groups that we'll speak with next Thursday at 6 o'clock, how 2 summers ago when I was in South Carolina, my brother-in-law completed basic training for the U.S. Army, and so we went down to Columbia, the capital of South Carolina. But I'd never been really to the coast since I was a kid when I went to Hilton Head Island, and again, that name Hilton comes from some Barbadian roots as well. Yep. Went down to Savannah and explored that area, and so next Thursday we will have individuals who are part of that Gullah Geechee culture and who are experts on the Gullah Geechee cultural heritage corridor to talk more about not just coming down to Barbados, which is wonderful, and I have the pleasure of serving as a diplomat here, but going up to the Carolinas or to Georgia or to Florida and to really experience that incredible history and slice of America there as well. So you have plenty to learn on both ends of the spectrum. Welcome. More questions from the group here. Kevin, I want to go back to something you mentioned, and that's something, again, if we go back to my own childhood, fascination with pirates. We talked a bit about Goose Creek Men and trading with pirates. Could you kind of tell us more about kind of that illegal piracy, privateer side of the history between Barbados and the Carolinas?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's best documented in Steve Bonnet, who was an aristocrat here in Barbados who, for whatever reason, decided to pack it in and go buy a ship and go down to the Carolinas and become a pirate, where he met up with Edward Teach, Blackbeard. But privateering, I'm going to say two things. Privateering, which was where letters of marque were given by the government that allowed sailors to go and raid enemy shipping, happened. And outside of privateering, piracy, where there were no letters of marque given. And these men and some women decided, okay, this is how I'm going to make my living. I'm going to raid shipping in order to make a living. And of course, head to different ports of call in which to sell their illegally gotten gains. That also occurred. And even with the production of rum, you found that planters and those people producing rum would put their sugar and rum in the bottoms of boats and go to other spaces and sell them so as not to pay taxes. So you've got different forms of privateering and piracy. But at the time, Charleston was a haven for pirates. The amount of shipping that was coming off the eastern seaboard at that time, and then being able to escape to places like Jamaica and Caymans and Turks in which to disappear. The various navies, whether they be British or Spanish or French, simply didn't have enough ships to catch you. So piracy is big business. It's a profitable business, but it's a dangerous business. As Steve Bonnet found out, he was hung. Well, him and a crew of 29 were hung. But his memory lives on because what happened? His folklore was such that it's passed down to us. And when you go to Charleston, there's a plaque there to commemorate Bonnet and his exploits, as infamous as they were. But piracy was part and parcel. If you think that one of the first governors of Jamaica, Henry Morgan, yes, he's not just a guy on a bottle of rum, was in fact a real character. He was a pirate turned privateer and then co-opted by the British government to help them to run an island at the time where quite a number of the shipping leaving Jamaica were pirates in and around Port Royal. So yeah.
Well, there's even the links of piracy to the slave trade as well. I think one of the projects you're working on right now is Blackbeard and his ship. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So early this year, and the people who've done the research on Blackbeard's ship in South Carolina, they were doing additional research, and they realized that before it became Blackbeard's ship, it was actually a French ship that was used to transport enslaved people. It was a slave ship originally. So there was a nice study workshop done on that. Again, looking at how do we now tell those two stories. It started out as a pirate story, but it's very much also a story about slavery. And it's necessary to tell that story from that one really large artifact, which is the ship. And to recognize that after 1807, where the British outlawed the transshipment of enslaved people, between 1807, let's say, to the 1865 for the US, 1880s for places like Brazil, transshipping people across the Atlantic was in fact an act of piracy. You were engaging in illegal activity. So piracy doesn't just end with notions of the end of Blackbeard and people stopping shipping for silver or whatever, but it continued in the transshipment of enslaved bodies across the Atlantic after 1807, and doesn't end until the 1880s on this side of the Atlantic. And the modern day equivalent is when we talk about human trafficking. That is slavery.
Yeah, it's I think of the story of the ship, the Amistad, which Steven Spielberg obviously made famous through his own film on the Spanish trading in slaves after the British had made it illegal. So, and then their trial all the way up to the Supreme Court and the eventual freedom for those individuals. A fascinating story. But again,
an amazing story.
I mean, I think that that was down in the current Spanish colonies of Cuba and other Spanish islands, but a similar story there.
Yeah, correct. RG is asked, how safe is Barbados compared to the US?
Because the United States is
well, yeah. Well, I don't know. It's a fantastic question, and I guess I'll basically say you're relatively safe. Like anywhere else, you're going to have crime, but like anywhere else where you live, you know where to go and where not to go. But we're safe, and in this time of COVID, a little safer as well as we all begin to vaccinate our populations as we come out of this pandemic. Which has been, I don't know, I can't even call it horrific, because you're living in the moment. So, and that makes it hard to distance. But yeah, and the proof is in the pudding. So, catch that American Airlines flight and come down.
I feel like we should start doing an advertisement for it. I mean, there are JetBlue flights and there are other.
Oh yeah, yes, there's JetBlue. There you go.
Put that out there. But I mean, I think that the incredible thing about Barbados too, though, is that the history is not just in Bridgetown and the Garrison, or it's not just St. Nicholas Abbey, I mean, you're going to find those gems of history across. Well, you would know better. Is it 166 square acres? How big is it?
166 square miles.
Square miles, yeah.
And I mean, what I'll say to you is, if you're a history buff, you like history. When you land on this island, as soon as you step off of the airplane, you're landing in a space that was inhabited by Amerindian people, and they were here for around just slightly earlier than 2000 BC. So you're coming to the island where people have been living on for past 5,000 years. So the history of the island goes back that far, and every single space you walk on, every place you drive, there is a history to that space. And incidentally, the airport was a former plantation called Sewell, but before that, it was an Amerindian place of habitation. Incidentally, it was owned by the same people who owned the Newton plantation. So there are those connections as well. So everywhere you go, there's a story to be told. There's something new to be found. Not too far from the airport, well, in Barbadian parlance, around the corner, 3 or 4 miles, you go to the Crane Hotel. Buffalo Bill Cody stayed there when he came to Barbados in, I think, the 1880s. So there's all those little small tidbits.
Yeah.
That we have an amazing history. And I know that I'm going to forget his name, but whenever you look up at the moon, just remember that one of the moon's craters is named after Barbadian, who was a astronomer. And yeah.
There's things throughout the island that continue to amaze me. There was a restaurant that opened down by Sam Lord's Castle, This Old House. Have you been?
This Old House. Yes, I've been. Fantastic place.
No, what's the history of that structure? I mean, I was told that it perhaps at one time was slave quarters for those who would have worked on that plantation, which I think too. I mean, I think Sam Lord, that is a historical person,
yes.
right?
Yes, Sam Lord is a historical figure who built this Regency style castellated house that became Sam Lord's Castle. I can't give you the history of this old house because I don't know, but looking at it, I would argue it's more slightly middle class chattel house that might have been owned by someone at a point in time. Just looking architecturally at what it is now. When we talk about enslaved houses, we're in the most part talking about single room homes built of limestone rubble with a gabled or hick roof, but single, not double like that. Yeah. But that's as much as I can say. I know you've now made me. I'm going to have to take the trek out to St. Philip to go to this old house, to walk around, to see what it is, and of course they're going to make me stay for lunch.
Absolutely, St. Philip is. I mean, I don't want to go too far out there, but St. Philip is my favorite parish.
Okay. There you go. And it is the largest parish in Barbados at 35 square miles.
Okay.
That might seem small, but there are a few Caribbean islands that are smaller than 35 square miles. So all things are relative.
Excellent. Welcome any questions as we head into the kind of final minutes here with Kevin. It was interesting speaking with those at This Old House. They talked about how, I guess, underneath when they were preparing the structure to restore it, they might have found things from the slavery period in and around Sam Lord's Castle. So plenty of more history.
Well, in that case, I definitely need to go and visit, and hopefully they've kept those things that we can take a look at and begin to authenticate. Because if that's the case, that would be utterly fantastic to have that larger discussion with them and to bring those artifacts to public knowledge and engage in some public discourse around.
Wonderful. Any final reflections on the film? I mean, again, there's so much packed into, as you say, that 56 minutes from Indians all the way to the present day.
I guess my comment in all things like that is that there needs to be more of it, simply because it's so densely packed. It'll be nice over time to begin to unpack it in different ways, because it's quite instructive, very informative, eye-opening, but it begs other questions that need to be answered. Heather says, as we begin to move around again, are there cultural or other heritage festivals that Americans can visit on the island to learn more about the deep cultural and historical connections between Barbados and the Carolinas, including language and music? However, my answer is yes, and it's crop over. And first crop over is almost a 6 to 2 month event where we do explore the history and the culinary history of the island, calypsos, and our use of masquerade. And it's a harvest festival as opposed to a religious festival, which most carnivals are. And I think they do explore some of those connections, but I think within them there's space actually to perhaps create new events that marry that Gullah Geechee Carolinian experience with ours. And I think that's something to explore. And Rhoda reminds us about the Barbados State clothes often referred to. Yes, they were, and they did take root in the Carolinas in the 1780s. And in fact, again, recognizing that some of the planters who were there at the time would have had plantations in Barbados or had colleagues in Barbados who'd written those slave laws, and they began to even share booklets amongst themselves. There's something called How to Manage Your Plantation and Treat Your Negroes, written in the 1780s. And Colleton is one of the authors who owns large tracts of land in the Carolinas. So you're seeing that the blueprint of what the Sugar Island is almost taken wholesale to the Carolinas. Adaptations are made to form the backbone of the economic and social structure that's created in the Carolinas, built on enslavement, but exploiting new produce like wood and rice and cattle.
Mm-hmm. I think just now living on the island for nearly 2 years, Kevin, when you talk about crop over, it's so authentic, because here in June, now well into June, you see those large trucks, oftentimes those baby blue trucks,
yes,
on the highway full of cane. And here we are hundreds of years later. I mean, this has been happening for hundreds of years in Barbados. Now it's mechanized. Before it was on the backs of enslaved individuals, but it's still that same sugarcane being harvested. And now looking forward to August, not only the celebration of emancipation, but also that now celebration of the end of the harvest, harvest with crop over. It's just so real. It's a daily experience almost with those with trucks and that cane today. And realize that those trucks are traveling roads that were set in place by the 1780s. Except for those who know Barbados, the ABC highway that runs north to south, the Spring Garden Highway, the East Coast Highway, and maybe 2 others. The road network in Barbados is fixed by 1780, and it's fixed because of sugar. It's that radial network generating from the port and moving north, south, east, and west to connect the port to plantations. And that's what we see there now today. Yes, I agree. Can't wait for you to visit. It's oftentimes those 2-city or out-of-city bus stop signs that are the only thing that keep me straight in Barbados, because when you think you're going straight, I'm from Chicago, and we laid out our grid long time ago. Yeah, you did. Long after Barbados did. Although there's one street that follows an old buffalo path through the west called Austin Avenue, but everything else is is straight. Those two city and out of city are oftentimes the only things that do keep me oriented on what's going on. There is of course, a visa question on here in a very different context than what than where we are here in Barbados. But I do want to mention that our consular section is processing visas right now. So if you do now, hopefully vaccinated, want to head up to the Carolinas and you need a tourist visa, you are able to, number one, renew your visa if you previously had one, if it expired in the last 4 years. That's the most open that window has been. Usually it's a year, or more recently in this past year, it's been 2 years. But if your visa has expired in the last 4 years, you can now renew and mail in your passport. And so that can all be done remotely. So do, as we've put on the screen there, check out our website, bb.usembassy.gov. But also, if you're a student headed to the States, we do prioritize students here at the embassy in Barbados. And don't wait for that even month before. If you're traveling in September, let's get started on that visa paperwork right now so that we can make sure that you arrive in time for classes wherever you're attending school in the United States. So please do check out the website, apply for the visa. You can renew online and just mail in your passport. For those for the first time who might require interviews, please do get started, and we'll want to schedule that as soon as possible. But yes, crop over, although with COVID, I think it'll be a little muted this year. There still will be celebrations, as Minister Bostic reminds me, we are not out of the woods yet with COVID here in Barbados. But hopefully, as we say, with recent announcements by the White House, by the Biden-Harris administration, that more vaccines will be released to CARICOM countries by the end of June. Millions of vaccines made available to Latin America and Caribbean by the United States. It's important that, as Heather says, we do get moving again, and we do get a chance to greet each other face to face. So with that, Kevin, any final words? Thank you so much for joining us. You know, I referenced this in a conversation yesterday. I called this like a fireside chat. And I thought, well, that's kind of like a culturally specific term, because not too many fireplaces here in Barbados. But I enjoyed the chat all the same, and wanted to give you the last word.
Same here. My last word is thank you very much for inviting me on. Thank you, everyone who's come to listen. Let's continue to explore that shared history between Barbados and Carolina, and the wider history between Barbados and the USA. Come visit, and we will visit in return. And thanks so much, Larry.
Thank you.
And I look forward to next week's talk with the Gullah Geechee community to discuss the corridor. Absolutely.
A reminder, that's 6 p.m. A week from today. That's next Thursday, June 17th. It is The Road to Emancipation, Exploring the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. Really look forward. Again, Kevin, you'll be moderating that discussion, I know. So it's a fantastic opportunity to learn more about the United States. And again, the links between Barbados and how so much of Barbados's history is tied up with what's happening now in the Carolinas. So thanks again, everyone. Hope to see you next week. Have a great week until then. Bye.
Okay. Bye, everyone.